Hamas completely controlled everything that was going on in Gaza. What is explosive and what is incredible is that now we have hardcore evidence of exactly how and to what extent this was happening. The worst part is that the international organizations didn't just fall victims to this Stasi-like regime. They were complicit.
Today we bring you an exclusive, the first interview in English. Olga Deutsch is the vice president of NGO Monitor, and last week they put out an explosive report connecting all the human rights organizations working in the Gaza Strip with the terrorist group Hamas. Olga, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me, Fleur, as always.
It's really incredible what you guys revealed last week. So I want you to take us back. When did this research start? What is the research about? And what does it tell us?
Well, it is incredible and it's not, right? We just had this conversation while entering the studio. There's nothing that most of us did not know. Hamas completely controlled everything that was going on in Gaza. It was sort of a Stasi little country there. What is explosive and what is incredible is that now we have hardcore evidence of exactly how and to what extent this was happening.
You mean the method of how they did it?
So this whole thing started a few months ago when we obtained original Hamas documents that the IDF soldiers seized from Gaza during the last couple of years, and then IDF declassified them. We are still, NGO Monitor, the only ones who have them. Now, it took us a few months to translate them from Arabic, but more than translate them, understand what the documents are really telling us, who are the documents from, and how all of the documents connect to our topics. Now, the documents basically allow us to completely map out how Hamas instrumentalized international humanitarian aid and all international organizations operating in Gaza, and consequently turned them into weapons of war. It served Hamas for military, strategic, and PR purposes, obviously.
When are these documents about? What are they recording? What exactly are they telling us? From what years? And maybe give us some examples of those very NGOs that they're instrumentalizing.
Of course. So the documents are basically reports written by Hamas ministry clerks, employees, to their superiors.
Right.
The ministry is, in colloquial terms, the Ministry of Police, the same ministry that was in charge of fighting local dissident against Hamas was also in charge of international aid and international NGOs, telling us how strategically they actually viewed aid and international NGOs. But more than that, also what kind of methods they resorted to when controlling them. The documents span between the years of 2018 and 2022, so just before October the 7th, painting a pretty accurate picture of how the life or how the humanitarian work looked like before October the 7th. So the reports will tell you that, for example, Hamas was conducting surveillance of all aid organizations and all their employees. Every NGO, every organization had to submit a list of employees that needed to be approved by Hamas. Every grant and every recipient needed to be okayed by Hamas, giving them basically complete control of who the aid goes to. But more than that, and this is probably the most the craziest of things, Hamas insisted on what they referred to guarantors, meaning they placed a Hamas person in a senior position in every organization. And this person had two goals. Number one, to liaison, right? To control where the NGO is going, what the organization is doing. But number two, making sure that the organization does not see, in their own words, what the organization is not allowed to see.
Wow.
So, for example, you'll have a medical organization, right, that would be interested in providing services in hospitals and medical centers.
Give us a name.
Well, amongst the 50 organizations that are named in the document, you will have names like Doctors Without Borders, like Norwegian Refugee Council, Oxfam, Handicap United, many organizations, some of the greatest names.
Red Cross is in there?
That Red Cross is not in there. But they ran basically a card, if you'd like, per organization, where they, based on the surveillance that they did, they monitored people, and they would write reports that went into such details that would say she dresses in a modest way according to Sharia laws. This one engages in immoral relationship with a woman that is not his wife.
So that's as saying what, we accept these people or we don't accept these people, or they just had a card on everyone?
So first of all, they had a card on everyone.
Wow.
Literally surveillance, including technological surveillance, cameras, but also monitoring people and then writing it up. Based on this, every organization and every organization's guarantor, right, liaison, was categorized in one of the three categories: cooperative, medium cooperative, or non-cooperative. Now, we just need to understand what cooperative or non-cooperative in Hamas terms means. Non-cooperative doesn't mean that the organization did not toe the line. It just means that they didn't do it voluntarily. They had to be summoned by Hamas, and then they still played along, because there was absolutely no way to do any kind of humanitarian or human rights work without towing the line.
Olga, how big is the humanitarian aid industry in Gaza? Because we're talking about 50 plus organizations. What are we talking about here in terms of staff and people? And
so there's no one number, right? Because if there's one field that is completely intransparent, that would be aid globally. But let me give you a number that will resonate.
Okay.
After October the 7th, right, the United Nations launched an emergency appeal for the last quarter of 2023. So the 3 months after October the 7th. And they asked the international community to raise $1.6 billion for Gaza alone in emergency aid for the 3 months.
For the 3 months after October 7th.
After October the 7th. Now, most of us, when we say humanitarian aid, we think food, baby formulas, tents, clothes, medicine, right. What very few people know is that anywhere between 10% and 1/3 of aid typically goes to non-physical aid, meaning political projects. Now, to get you even more into the weeds of this, when we dig deeper to see what these reports, what these political advocacy projects are, typically we will map them and to Palestinian organizations lobbying ICC, ICJ, United Nations Commission of Inquiry.
So the propaganda.
So then the picture becomes even bigger.
In other words, the aid they're receiving, 1/3 of it, or 10% to 1/3 of it, is going into the propaganda of terrorists.
Why? And this is basically I think the most important, we can go into details of more and more how they did it exactly. But the point is that Hamas knew very well that their military operations are complementary to their narrative/political war that was international.
It's part of their strategy.
It's part of their strategy. It's part of how they're normalized their activities, how they normalized their narratives. And the worst part is that the international organizations didn't just fall victims to this Stasi-like regime. They were complicit. Because think of the picture when one of the documents that we revealed says every hospital in Gaza had a Hamas wing. That everyone in the hospital, including the NGO world, knew.
They knew it.
That they knew it, but not only knew it, they knew that when there are Hamas operatives in the building, no one is to get anywhere near this wing. Now, with everything that we now know, picture a situation where IDF in the last 2 years bombs, right, somewhere near a hospital in Gaza, and the NGOs know exactly why IDF is doing that. But not only are they towing the line, but they're the first ones to condemn Israel for targeting civilians, for targeting civilian, hospitals, like the civilian targets and so on. So the complicity was incredible. Now, let's assume, because I'm always challenged when I speak around the world in parliaments and so on, I'm always challenged, but look, it's a it's a territory controlled by a terror organization. So in order to provide aid,
Do anything.
you need to do whatever you need to do,
Yeah.
right? Let's assume that was true until October the 7th to a certain extent. But what happened after October the 7th? We have had so much evidence revealed publicly of UNRWA employees' complicity, of them holding hostages and so on. Not a single NGO stepped up and said, there is something rotten in the system. There is something structurally.
Not because they
flawed.
don't know,
They know.
but because what you're saying is it's not because they don't know. They know. They know. It's because either A, they have their own political agenda, or B, they just turn a blind eye and nothing to see here so that they can continue their activities.
Well, either way, knowing the full scope of what was going on there and how much enabling they have done for Hamas, especially now in the last couple of years when there was so much drama surrounding humanitarian aid, there was so much drama accusing Israel of starvation and genocide and so on, you would have expected at least one of them to come forth and say, look, it wasn't perfect, it was horrible, but moving forward, we really want to provide aid to the people in need. And now...
And not only that, actively going against the Gaza Humanitarian Aid Foundation as an alternative that did not include Hamas. The NGOs were the ones who went against this.
Exactly.
Why?
Well...
Getting rid of themselves? Because this was like their raison d'etre.
That is $1 million questions that we cannot answer. We can speculate, right? And for sure, some of them are surely ideological and take a side. I think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, even in the context of humanitarian aid, is the single most politicized conflict. This is the only place where you have humanitarian workers, doctors arriving with ready-made political assumptions and opinions that then they attach and apply to their medical services, right? You don't see that happening anywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
But I think there's also something inherently flawed with the system of how aid is provided, how governments around the world choose which organizations they work with, which organizations they trust, right? And especially now, as we are talking about the second stage, which does not only include disarmament of Hamas, but also who is going to govern Gaza,
who's going to reconstruct.
Right? We need to understand the price tag being attached right now to the reconstruction of Gaza is around $70 billion.
Oh my
In
God.
the next few years, there is no economy in Gaza other than international aid and reconstruction money. That's the only economy that will be the only employer, right? And the only economical engine of Gaza. So the question of who distributes this, who is in control of this, becomes that much more central.
Olga, NGO Monitor, which you've led so well over so many years, yourself and Gerald, are experts at following the money. What can you tell us that we don't know about the way the money kind of made itself? And, you know, if people knew it was going to terrorists, if big international organizations were okay with that, or was it done very carefully and it was still done separate? What could you tell us about that whole system?
Well, I think it's an excellent question, and typically not one you can answer with a yes or no or a one-liner. You know, we speak a lot about Qatar funding, right? Or what the role of Turkey will be moving forward. And we know that they too have funded a lot in East Jerusalem and are even already invested in Gaza. But those are the things that are much more difficult for us to control, to monitor. There's no transparency. We're talking about states that have been sponsoring terror in many ways for decades. What we can focus on is the international aid. When we talk about the international community, we basically talk about around 30 developed countries, US, Canada, EU, and only wealthier EU states, and Australia and Japan to a limited extent. So the pool is very limited, right? And they have been, since the Oslo Accords, they have siphoned hundreds of millions, probably billions of dollars in aid.
To who?
to Palestinian organizations, to international organizations. Now, if you take aside the PA, the aid that goes directly to the PA, there is still an incredible amount of money that goes to international organizations
NGOs.
and then operate inside of Gaza, and then to UN, and then to local organizations. And they deal with all kinds of projects. They span from agricultural, infrastructural projects. These two are referred to as humanitarian aid or human rights projects. Where that money is going and how it is being distributed is a critical question. And this I can tell you, most of the parliamentarians around the world themselves don't know. They don't know.
They don't know, and it's almost like, not that they don't care, Olga, but like they've almost, the transparency is something that is secondary to looking like they're doing the right thing.
We tend to believe that it is also small money, and it's not.
It's not small money.
Until October the 7th, almost automatically, parliamentarians or even congressmen will refer to this topic as a marginal thing. Next to UNRWA, it's nothing of significance. And that is just not true. We're talking about billions of dollars.
And nobody asks themselves how come the leadership of Hamas sitting in Doha are billionaires. Nobody asks themselves how you have a population of oligarchs, essentially.
Just like every other terror organization, Hamas too uses dormant terrorists, meaning they will give them lucrative jobs, oftentimes in mosques or NGOs around the world, right? In organizations dealing with welfare and human rights and soft issues that run under the radar of their respective governments, to do a few things. Number one, it's lucrative jobs. But number two, this is where they mobilize, recruit, and radicalize, right? And spread the narrative and spread the political influence way beyond Gaza. There is a direct link between what goes on in Gaza and what goes on the streets of Washington, Toronto, Berlin, or Paris.
That's scary, Olga.
It is very scary.
What do you mean? They are now using the propaganda. They're using the aid for propaganda money and the radicalization of these societies that are giving them the money in the first place. So it's like this vicious, poisonous circle.
It is a vicious, poisonous circle because terror organizations understand that words matter.
Of course.
Arms are not the only way in which they wage their terror wars. Now, somehow, and even when I speak to counter-terror experts, when we talk about Al-Qaeda or Daesh or any other terror organization, this is common knowledge. This is basics of counter-terror. But when we talk about Palestinian terror organizations, and Hamas is the biggest and the most vicious, but don't you be fooled. PFLP is
Palestinian
Front for the Liberation of Palestine, is politically the most active.
Wow, what does that mean? Where do you see them?
In parliaments and in Congress, and abusing the human rights, like when we say weaponization of human rights, think PFLP affiliated human rights organizations. Like Al-Haq, like Defense for Children International /Palestine, like Al-Mazan. The State Department just in September designated 3 such organizations for their lawfare activities that are anti-American, but basically at the International Criminal Court in The Hague.
Which they did a good job lobbying, it turns out. They
did a great job, and it was the right thing to do. But it just tells you the scope of their work. Now, whatever when Al-Haq goes and lobbies the United Nations to create the Commission of Inquiry to investigate Israel, that creates the legal basis for the legal cases against us, both at the ICC and ICJ in The Hague, right? When we analyze the ICJ South African claim against Israel, first of all, it was co-authored by a former Al-Haq and a former Human Rights Watch employees. But more interestingly, it had 22 footnotes leading to NGO reports. The NGO, the human rights community, or the way that they manipulate it, is it's the main vehicle giving political language or political side,
legitimacy,
Palestinian terror language, if you'd like. So again, going back to the report, we didn't find something that we didn't know.
Right.
Were we shocked how systematic and methodological and all comprehensive it was? Absolutely.
You didn't realize it was such a kind of
It was
complicated,
a
deliberate
meticulous-
operation.
A meticulous operation.
Wow.
Imagine a situation. One of these reports details a situation where the Hamas ministry, right? People bring a delegation visiting from abroad of Norwegian Refugee Council, one of the biggest international humanitarian organizations around the world, funded by UK, EU, German government, and so on, cooperating with all the governments around the world, more or less. And they bring them to an apartment of an elderly couple in Gaza, recipient of aid.
Right.
And the elderly couple says, our floor is trembling and is shaking, and we fear that there might be a tunnel underneath our apartment. And the report says, and no one engaged on the question with them. Meaning they knew, they purposely did not want to acknowledge it, to put it on paper, to give it a voice. The complicity was full. Now, contrast that complicity with the condemnation,
Yes.
the one-sided, unquestioned condemnation of Israel. And more than condemnation, a global campaign to
Yes.
portray Israel as the worst violator
Yes.
of every international law.
Which they knew because they were planning. They knew that October 7th would create a huge reaction from Israel, but they also knew that they had the humanitarian aid community on their side. They knew that. This was all part of the plan. I mean, the whole thing is crazy when you think about it, but so sophisticated at the same time, and everybody going along with it. So my question is now, where do we go from here? What do we have to do? Olga, you're going around to European parliaments telling them this. What is the reaction? What is the reaction? Are you seeing something move? Because you and I have been advocating against UNRWA for many years. Myself, when I was in Jerusalem, and we had this very, very toxic, hatred-filled curriculum that your organization did work on. I did my political work lobbying to governments not to fund UNRWA unless they changed the curriculum. That never happened. The Americans stopped funding it under Trump, then they funded it again under Biden, then now it's not funded again under Trump. But UNRWA is still going. And in fact, my sources tell me have raised more money than ever now because of Gaza. So how do we stop this vicious cycle of terrorism feeding humanitarian aid organizations that are feeding the terrorists? How do we do it? And what is the reaction when you go around with your important lobbying work?
Well, you're right. I just came back from Switzerland, actually, where I spoke at the parliament in Bern. And next week, I will be in the Bundestag in Germany presenting the findings of the report, because this is the critical time.
Yeah.
The governments are deliberating now how much they want to allocate towards the reconstruction of Gaza.
Yeah.
I think there's a few answers to that question, a few elements. We have to work with the governments. Look, the NGOs, I don't know. Can we fight every one of them? Can we try to uproot ideologists in each one of them? There's always going to be crazy people. There's always going to be political activism.
But isn't it against the terms of an NGO
Absolutely.
that they're supporting or being complicit with terrorists? Shouldn't that cancel their NGO status?
Which is why we need to regulate. We need to go to the governments and we need to demand that they work with us in regulating the public space. And this goes across the policy areas. When it comes to funding, how do you choose who you work with? Who do you give money to? What do the contracts say? How do you control? Like, meaning what are the controls, oversight,
Accountability.
mechanisms, basic accountability.
There's nothing.
That we apply to any other sphere of life,
Of
right?
course.
Public or most certainly public, but any sphere of life as well. Then we need to go to governments and say, okay, let's look at UN. UNRWA is such a great example. At the end of the day, whether it's called UNRWA or it's called something else, whoever will be in charge of education system in Gaza will have to work with the same 35,000 local Gazans, right, to make the whole system run. Who will control them? What will be the guidelines? What are the red lines? What are the sanctions? One of the things we see with legislators, even when they legislate, and yes, since October the 7th, there has been an awakening and much greater awareness, but I fear that there is sort of confusion as to how to translate it into tangible policies that actually make any difference on the ground. Because even when governments legislate, it doesn't mean that it's being implemented. Because in order to have a law implemented, you have to write an executive order translating exactly which agency and how should implement it, and what do you expect from that agency to report on, say, in a year from now. And then you also have to stipulate legally binding sanctions should that agency not implement that, and so on and so on. So there's 5-6 more layers that need to come after the legislation, and legislating is already difficult enough. But if I zoomed out now in an attempt to answer your question with one-liner, to my mind, if the United States of America do not move the needle on this, I don't think
Nobody else will.
I don't think anyone else will. Sadly, the Europeans, their role has been pretty marginal in the last 2 years, but dangerously. The main tool that they have at their disposal is money. So it will be international aid and humanitarian aid. But if the American administration, the US administration does not say, we will not tolerate any terror affiliation, we will not tolerate any organization that is not properly vetted, we will not tolerate UN unless, or any UN agency unless they adopt a strategy on combating anti-Semitism, unless they designate Hamas, PFLP, and Islamic Jihad as terror groups. I mean, we have governments around the world who regard these as terror organizations. They grapple with their own challenges as well. But the UN doesn't even have a terror list, right? So,
At all.
So what do we expect from them?
Olga, you paint a very depressing picture of how we got to where we got to today. The Americans tried their best, I think, with Israel, with the Gaza Humanitarian Aid Foundation, which I think, in a way, in the end, ended up breaking Hamas to the point that we got them to. So I think that was brilliant. The question is, I guess, the Americans have now designated the Muslim Brotherhood in certain countries as a terrorist group. Does that help? So that's my first part of the question. And the second part of the question is, do you perceive perhaps a desire for an alternative system like the Gaza Humanitarian Aid Foundation in general in Gaza? Do you feel that that's in the air?
So every designation counts and matters on multiple levels. Number one, it is important to understand, designated a group as a terror group first and foremost has financial ramifications.
Yes.
This is what it is. It's a legal tool basically saying you can't have bank accounts, you can't operate any financial transactions, and the respective governments have the right to raid offices, confiscate, close down, and so on. So, but that's the most immediate, right, level. But on a broader political level, it educates the public in saying Hamas is a terror organization. Muslim Brotherhood is a terror organization. Because as we've seen in the last 2 years, there's too many people who just don't know. Yeah. You know, when you ask them what Hamas is, a lot of we call them useful idiots, but whatever you choose to call them.
Resistance group.
They thought they were a resistance group. Now, this is Hamas, whose name they hear 5 times a day on the news. They don't hear the same about PFLP or Islamic Jihad, right? So these things absolutely matter. But that's the first lever. Then take the Samidun designation, right? The U.S. government and Canadian government designated Samidun, which is one of the main groups behind the campus violence in the last couple of years in North America. They designated them, which was an amazing step. But now more needs to follow. They need to designate or sanction all those giving them hand, raising money for them now, working with them, and so on. So it does matter, but there's more work to be done. So the second part of your question is much trickier. It takes tremendous political will and capital to craft a completely new model, if you will.
Yeah.
It means completely from scratch revamping not only the structure and the infrastructure, but a paradigm of how the world and the international community views providing aid, working in Gaza, and looking at the Palestinian issue. And I don't know if you and I have the answer to that. I think we are in a historical moment of a historical opportunity that I'm not sure will present itself anytime soon.
It's kind of an opportunity for a restart in a way. I mean, it's a very simple way of putting it, but do you know what I mean? If now Gaza is going to be reconstructed, if we know how poisonous and how complicit these organizations are, we need something new. I assume that NGO Monitor is now going to go and lobby the American government about this.
We're going to go to every parliament around the world and obviously to Congress with this report because we think that it finally gives hard evidence
To what we were saying.
to what we were saying. Because, we always said where there's smoke, there's got to be fire.
Yeah.
But we kept always receiving the same answer. Give me evidence. As if anyone could have provided a cable from a terrorist organization, showing the direct lines, financial transactions between them and others. But now we actually have. So we will be taking this to every parliament in the world and Congress, hoping that really that the U.S. administration will have the courage. I think it takes courage
I agree.
to recalibrate how we look at this entirely. We talk about what is right and wrong a lot, right? And all of us here in Israel, having lived through the past 2 years, we now see more and more hostages coming out with the same line.
Same
There's not a
stories.
single innocent Gazan person. But I challenge the parliamentarians outside of the borders of Israel, and I say, you know what? Don't do it for the sake of the Israelis. Don't do it for the sake of the Jews. You want to provide aid. You want to provide a better tomorrow for the Palestinian people. Then give them a chance of actually having a normal society where people are not raised from kindergarten to hate and to want to kill us as the highest value, right? And then the first way to sort of tap into that is to turn upside down the aid instrument instead of allowing it to go back to what it was before October the 7th, which is lending a hand to Hamas and fortifying its full control of everything inside of Gaza, turn it into a positive strategic agent of change and gradual de-radicalization. But these are such big words, and this is not a quick fix. It's not something that you can do overnight or even within a year. It would take political imagination, creativity, and courage, almost like the one after the Second World War, to approach the project from re-education perspective and give a hope to the whole region. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Well, the fact that the humanitarian aid community have essentially perpetuated a terrorist group and the misery of the Gazans should be exposed. And so I thank you and your incredible organization, NGO Monitor, for really shining a light on what a lot of us felt, but we couldn't pinpoint it. And you are now going out on this campaign to basically try and help the Gazans have a decent society, not live with entitlements and terrorism and subjugation. So God bless you for the work that you do, Olga. I can't wait to see the results of this incredible work. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Flora, for all that you do and for giving us this incredible platform to share the findings of our work. And I hope you and I will have many more opportunities to shed a little bit of truth.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Olga.
Thank you.